This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, we explore the history of the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, the Jamestown Settlement, established in 1607. Joining C-SPAN is Amy Stallings, lecturer at the College of William and Mary, who has done extensive research on Jamestown's tumultuous early years and the ongoing efforts to preserve its legacy over the past 4 centuries. Established by the Virginia Company of London on a peninsula in the James River, Jamestown faced many challenges: a lack of food, deadly diseases, and conflicts with the local Powhatan Confederacy. More after this.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Amy Stallings, and I'm an adjunct history professor here at the College of William and Mary. And today you find my class, Era of Jamestown, here in SWEM Special Collections. That's our library on campus, where they have pulled for us an array of items relating to the history of Jamestown. And my lecture for the day is also detailing how Jamestown was lost, and I mean that in a physical, geographical sense, but I also wanted to examine how Jamestown was, quote, lost to memory, and the ways in which, especially in the 19th century, Virginians and Americans more broadly sought to find Jamestown and reclaim Jamestown on the assumption that the physical location was gone. So that's the context, and off we go. So all semester, we've been progressing through the history of Jamestown approximately 1 decade per week, with some extra attention given to setting the scene for the contacts and conflicts that followed. We've learned from Philip Levy that the palisade wall constructed in 1634 to demarcate the bounds of English territory became a backbone for English settlement patterns, drawing well-to-do planters such as the Ludwells and Pages out of the capital city at Jamestown to the area called Middle Plantation. And last week, we briefly visited the foundations of the Page House, and we've discussed the establishment of Bruton Parish Church in the 1670s and the College of William and Mary in 1693. Both of these features increased the appeal of Middle Plantation as a viable community with the promise of future growth. After the burning of the first Jamestown State House, along with the rest of the city, in Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, the government met initially at Green Spring, the home of Sir William Berkeley. This is a view of Green Spring after it was remodeled significantly by the Ludwell family and then the Lee family. This watercolor done by Benjamin Henry Latrobe in 1796. But this is one of the places where it all happened. But there was some question in the late 1670s over the reconstruction of the new State House and where to put it. It wasn't ultimately constructed until 1684 and on the same spot as the previous one, but being peripatetic was familiar to the House of Burgesses, who had never had a purpose-built meeting space until 1665 anyway. The replacement State House would meet a similarly fiery end in 1698, the victim of suspected arson, because nothing ever burns just once in Virginia before you give up on it. It has to burn at least twice. And give up on it they did in 1699. Influential members of the government, such as Ludwell and Page, plus Reverend James Blair, the president of the new College of William and Mary, were strong advocates for shifting the government to Middle Plantation, believe it or not, the highest point of land in this part of the peninsula. Joining them in the endeavor was Governor Francis Nicholson, an eager amateur town planner who would design Williamsburg in the Baroque style, building ciphers of the letters W and M into the road plan. And here you see a famous depiction of Williamsburg as it would come to be known. Circa 1781, this is known as the Frenchman's Map. And it's hanging in my office. Not the real one, obviously. With the departure of government activity from Jamestown, the population whose businesses or social interests depended on a presence in the capital city began slowly to migrate 6.5 miles down the road. Around 1750, for instance, the circa 1680s church that still stood at Jamestown was discontinued as a separate parish. There weren't enough parishioners to make it worth the while. And some of its features, such as the baptismal font, were transferred to Bruton, where they will be very happy to show you the baptismal font from Jamestown if you visit today. As residents sold off their townhouse plots and farmsteads across the island between 1700 and 1750, two families consolidated the land patents, the Amblers and the Travises. The remainder of the 18th century saw the deliberate deconstruction of James City and its surroundings so that the whole might be converted to agriculture. The church building, still standing but crumbling in July of 1781, became a makeshift hospital for wounded soldiers who had participated in the nearby Battle of Greenspring, an important clash between the forces of British General Charles Cornwallis and those of the Marquis de Lafayette. Wildly outnumbered, the Americans, under Anthony Wayne, marched in anyway with fixed bayonets, before Lafayette's call to retreat saved the army from total annihilation. Cornwallis, meanwhile, was unsure whether American reinforcements might be following right behind. Wayne's confident assault had given him pause, so rather than press his advantage and capture Wayne, Lafayette, and some 4,000 Continentals, he ferried his men across the James River and took up a new position at Yorktown. It was a brief and in some respects a rather stupid engagement, but it set the stage for the eventual capture of Cornwallis's army in October. Sometime between 1781 and 1805, the Jamestown Church was dismantled, with the exception of the 1680s tower. You'd think that this was an event worth a mention in somebody's letter or diary, but so far historians have yet to track down a more precise date. But this view of the ruined tower was painted by Frenchman Louis Girardin. It appeared in 1805 in a magazine called Amenitates Graphica. Forgive the mispronunciation of Latin. He remarked in the same volume that, when compared with those superb fragments of a bold and majestic architecture which Europe, Syria, Greece, Italy, and other regions present to admiring travelers, the ruins of Jamestown are humble and inconsiderable, but they were nonetheless the cradle of Virginia. Girardin also may have originated the rumor that the original fort site had eroded into the river, a lamentation of loss that would resonate powerfully with 19th and early 20th century Virginians, and not be disproved until 1994, when a team of archaeologists headed by Bill Kelso did uncover the first of 3 palisade walls belonging to the original triangular James Fort. So in Girardin's article, he observed that many yards of the palisade erected by the first settlers were still visible an estimated 150 paces off the shore. Oh, that was actually, rewind, sorry, that was just me gesticulating wildly. I'll try to refrain. Had Girardin been a local to the area, he might have been better prepared to interpret what he saw as what it probably was, the decaying remains of old wharves. The last reference to a palisaded fort at Jamestown dates to 1627, when it is said to be in a state of disrepair, as it had ceased to serve any defensive purpose. So subsequently, it must have been taken down to make room for the new townhouse lots that were popping up all along the city's main road. But the nostalgic image of the swept-away fort inspired the popular imagination. It was a Jamestown frozen in time, revered because of what it had come to symbolize to the future. Made a much prettier story than the logical truth that it was a casualty of progress in a past where it had outlived its value. Oh, that old thing, a 17th century townsperson might have said. We demolished it because it was obsolete. But late 18th and 19th century history thrived on obsolescence, on fragments of a mythologized heroic age gone by. Some of this had been spurred on by the French Revolution, and a sense that the excesses of the Reign of Terror and the Republic of Virtue had gone too far in wiping away centuries of tradition in both religion and politics. Girardin himself was a refugee from the French Revolution, keenly sensitive to the disorienting rapidity of change in his home country. And partly in response to the influx of French Catholic refugees to England, it became a popular pastime in England to travel to and admire the dilapidated abbeys and monasteries that had been left to suffer the depredations of time after the dissolution more than 250 years before. This is how we get what is arguably William Wordsworth's most famous poem, Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey. So this philosophy coincided with and reinforced a landscaping craze that encouraged grand estates to erect ruined temples, grottos, and castles as focal points of their grounds. And you, my students, knew I had to incorporate some kind of Jane Austen reference today. This is it. So this is an estate called Stourhead, which was one of the filming locations for the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. But more importantly, for our purposes, you can see an example of a totally fake ancient temple across this also man-made, very cultivated, curated lake. Okay. So better yet, if you had a property that already had a ruin on it, you could just use that instead. Fountains Abbey. Yet another one of these properties where you've got a genuine ancient abbey that's falling to bits, made worse by the fact that the new owners of this area robbed out the stone to build their new manor house. But, then they went on to create this, again, very manicured river here, which flows out of the stream that originally ran behind fountains, and set up on a hill where there is another faux temple where I was standing when I took this photo, to look down this perfectly arranged avenue of trees for the beautiful framing of the abbey ruins in the distance, and they decided to call this spot Anne Boleyn's seat for reasons that make no logical sense. She was never there. Or you could even ruin your ruin a little more until it looked perfectly picturesque and romantically inspirational. And this is Scotney Castle, where they did precisely that. They just took down bits and pieces and said a little more off the top until it was in a sufficient state of disrepair for them to consider an attractive element of their artistic landscape here. So this kind of romanticism and these kinds of images, I think you will see reflected in some of the depictions of the church tower at Jamestown during this same period. It's all being influenced by these same schools of thought and artistic practices. So our friend Girardin gushed of Jamestown that, again, the emotions with the aspect of those national vestiges conveys to the soul are powerfully enthusiastic, rapturously melancholy. And Girardin called upon Americans to preserve these rude national vestiges at Jamestown and honor them in a similar manner to European relics. Again, were not a total enclosure of so sacred a spot at the national expense highly commendable, he asked his readers. And 2 years later, other voices joined the call for action. So next week, you will read about the Jamestown Jubilees, a series of 19th century celebrations promoted to highlight the critical role of Jamestown in the foundation of the United States. The first of these, called the Grand National Jubilee, transpired in 1807 for the 200th anniversary of the landing of the English colonists. Newspaper accounts of the gathering report as many as 2,000 persons in attendance, a theatrical troupe from Norfolk, boats providing a cannon salute, and a moving oration from Bishop James Madison. What they do not reveal is any significant attendance on the national level. These are almost all Virginians who are coming to Jamestown, but they're still going to give it the title of Grand National Jubilee. The churchyard features prominently in these reports, romanticized as a place where the patriotic spirits of the day could commune with the dust of their glorious forebears, learning to imitate their virtues and carry on the experiment in representative government begun in 1619. Now, this sort of language is characteristic of the broader propaganda of this period, but it served a still more urgent purpose when it concerned Jamestown. Americans were seeking their own origin myths, desperately seeking, you might say, so much so that when Englishwoman and novelist Frances Trollope made a tour of the fledgling nation in 1828, she recounted the following. It'll be two. Yeah. Once in Ohio, and once in the District of Columbia, I had an atlas displayed before me that I might be convinced by the evidence of my own eyes what a very contemptible little country I came from. I shall never forget the gravity with which, on the latter occasion, a gentleman drew out his graduated pencil case and showed me past contradiction that the whole of the British dominions did not equal in size one of their least important states, nor the air with which, after the demonstration, he placed his feet upon the chimney-piece considerably higher than his head and whistled Yankee Doodle. Virginians at the turn of the 19th century lamented that promoters of Massachusetts had gained momentum, hosting celebratory parades and speeches to mark the landing of the Pilgrims in 1620, as though the Jamestown venture had not preceded that event by 13 years. Some complained that patriotism and regional pride were waning in the storied Old Dominion, that the public paid no attention to its own history, and that pride was wounded among those who cared by the ascendancy of the Pilgrim narrative to the detriment of John Smith, Christopher Newport, and their ilk. As the century marched on, historians and novelists alike engaged in a sort of proxy war over the comparative significance of Jamestown versus Plymouth, the virtues and vices of each colony, the magnitude of their participation in the American Revolution, and ultimately the legacy of foundational American principles belonging to each. Building on the historical romance genre popularized by Sir Walter Scott, Northerners like Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and James Fenimore Cooper enthralled their readers with tales that wove regional events into their fiction. Southerners responded with William Gilmore Simms leading the pack. And if you cast your minds back to the very first class of this semester, you'll remember that I discussed the prescriptive value of fiction to late 18th and 19th century readers. That is to say, fiction was instructional and more entertaining perhaps than learning the same lessons in history books. A major aim of many novels was to highlight and exaggerate heroic and villainous figures, encouraging readers to imitate the positive and avoid the negative. As Oscar Wilde would quip at the end of the century, the good ended happily and the bad unhappily. That is what fiction means. Through the medium of popular culture, then, Virginians were able to envision and persuade others to envision their 17th century past as noble, courageous, and providential. Virginia was America, insisted this narrative, in the face of New England's challenge to the title. Paintings after the style Girardin had established portrayed the lonely Jamestown church tower and broken tombs, much like the ruins of ancient civilizations of the Old World. And here is one such depiction by John Chapman. He made several watercolors or paintings of things associated with Jamestown so well you may not have seen this one before. You are very likely to have seen his depiction of the marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, which becomes one of the foundational myths that is crucial to Virginia's understanding of itself in the 19th century. And that shows up not just in imagery, but also in literature. As early as 1804, there appeared J. Davis's The First Settlers of Virginia, one of a number of texts that glorified Pocahontas's supposed rescue of Captain John Smith and elevated her to a sort of patron saint of Virginia. My Lady Pocahontas by John Eston Cook followed in 1885 and lent fresh creepiness to the genre of courtly romance by depicting lonely English soldiers drawn to the beauty and dignity of a precocious tween girl. Similar airbrushing was applied to Nathaniel Bacon, the leader of the 1676 rebellion who burned Jamestown to the ground and dedicated himself to the extirpation of all Virginia Indians. However, instead of that portrayal, literature enshrined him as a chivalric hero, most notably in The Cavaliers of Virginia, published 1834 by William Carruthers. The physical characteristics of Jamestown, too, became the subject of florid poetry and prose, sadly lacking in the delicate touches of a Wordsworth.
In the winter, the shrill winds whistle through this memorial of another age, and in the summer, the poison oak and the wild jessamine mingle their thick leaves and intertwine their scarlet and golden flowers, and the ivy green wreathes its fantastic folds around and about it. The owl nestles and brings forth its young in its crannies unmolested, and is answered by its own wild echoes as it croons undisturbed its ghostly serenade to the midnight moon. That tower is silent. The dead slumber on, and the past can never return. It goes on. This is just a small sampling of this entry by Reverend John McCabe in American Ecclesiastical History. So, I picked only the best for you, I promise. This is, of course, in reference to that lonely church tower. And into the midst of this search for Virginian identity came the Civil War. At its end, not only had Virginia, the self-proclaimed mother of presidents, become the capital of a power hostile to the United States, but it had been economically and physically destroyed. Jamestown Island, though it saw no actual combat, was first the site of a Confederate fort dubbed Fort Pocahontas in 1861. In fact, we know now what they did not, that Fort Pocahontas was situated precisely on the footprint of the 1607 James Fort. Many of the same strategic advantages that made it a desirable location in the early 17th century continued to influence 19th century military minds. So we have here a map potentially created by a spy, and there is a facsimile here as well. The original is currently being conserved, but will be back. We're very excited to have it. You can see the extent of the Confederate earthworks and encampment, and this is very much not to scale as a depiction of Jamestown Island, but it shows a lot of really cool stuff that our archaeologists are now able to investigate with a little bit more exactness.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
So there are very likely bits and pieces of James Fort spread across the South in the attics of old homes, taken as souvenirs by soldiers who didn't fully comprehend what they signified. The soldiers garrisoned here did write home to their families about ancient bits of arms and armaments and pipe stems and other relics that were being turned up by their shovels or eroding out of the banks. But the Confederate presence here was short-lived. After federal troops occupied the area in 1862, the island became a refuge for the formerly enslaved, who had escaped to Union lines by the thousands and were considered contraband of war. So there was a contraband camp out there on Jamestown Island. The area would remain occupied by federal troops until 1870. Residents chafing at the power of the soldiers they considered enemies. Cynthia Coleman, whose name you will hear again, wrote that she did not like, quote, these fat, sleek Yankees to come to spy upon our poverty. And there was real hardship, devastation, and loss. The Battle of Williamsburg in 1862 had left more dead and wounded soldiers needing care than there were citizens in the town of Williamsburg. And throughout Reconstruction, local women especially felt a fierce loyalty to Virginia traditions, both real and imagined. Meanwhile, production of history books shifted to the Northeast, to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and minimized the role of Jamestown and Virginia in establishing America's founding principles. And this was both a natural outgrowth of regional bias and a more deliberate curatorial decision. Virginia's past was no longer something to laud at the national level, as it had seemed to be prior to the Civil War. And out of this post-bellum environment grew the lost cause mythology, but also a variety of women's associations dedicated to rehabilitating and promoting the image of the past they believed in and held dear. That past placed Virginia and its institutions at the heart of the American experience. And one such group, championed by Cynthia Coleman, Lucy Bagby, and Mary Galt, was the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, or APVA, founded in 1889. The degree to which the women of the APVA supported the lost cause varied by individual. They consciously excluded that ideology from their public platform, though they espoused notions of social hierarchy and held a disdain for industrialized society that lent the lost cause their unspoken support. Their organization and the sites they maintained were emphatically white spaces, erasing and discouraging any discussion of slavery. Members of the APVA were traditionalists, part of the old elite, intent on saving the remnants of colonial Virginia because, as they themselves opined, that which is oldest is best, a phrase that could equally be applied to their own family lineages. The APVA managed in 1893 to wrangle from a northern industrialist named E.E. Barney 22.5 acres of land on the island he had recently purchased, Jamestown Island. The plot acquired by this preservation society contained the iconic church tower and its associated cemetery, which was swiftly eroding into the river. So here you have a view of the old cemetery area, the church foundations area, looking out towards the river. And actually you can see pieces of what is the Knight's Tomb now, which is has been not interred, but it's in the chancel now. You can see here the position has shifted, but they did conduct in the 1890s, sponsor archaeology to uncover the foundations of the 3 iterations of church buildings that had sat on this site in the 17th century. And they also installed a seawall to prevent further loss of shoreline. You genuinely had skeletons just tumbling out onto the beach, so the seawall helped to mitigate that problem. However, the process of interpreting the site was not as straightforward as saving it. The Society's members disagreed, some of them bitterly, over how best to respect the existing ruins, whether to refurbish or rebuild them, how to landscape the area, whether to erect memorials and to whom, and whether the bricks from a collapsed 17th century structure might, in good conscience, be sold as mementos to raise funds. You could get your own Jamestown brick even in the 1890s. Now we'll send you a stuffed animal. A possum is the latest offering. The construction of the Memorial Church in 1906, in preparation for the 300th anniversary of the founding the following year, drew significant criticism from within the organization. But here you see it at sunset, not the best time perhaps because it's backlit, but it is modeled on St. Luke's Church over in Smithfield, which does date to the same period as the last brick church at Jamestown in the 1680s. The Jamestown Exposition in 1907 brought visitors to the island, yes, but the bulk of the effort was centered in Norfolk, where the goal was to replicate the success of the recent World's Fairs. This was a miserable failure. Construction lagged behind, exhibits were left uninstalled, and the public did not throng as promised. In some respects, 1907 was more a show of naval power than a reflection on the past, and that didn't sit well with all attendees. It was clearly a display of force. The project suffered a severe financial loss, despite the attendance of President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1957, so we're now at the 350th, the state of Virginia tried again, but it couldn't return to Norfolk because the site of the 1907 exhibition had become the Norfolk Naval Base. The rest of Jamestown Island in 1934 had been acquired by the National Park Service, so that too was unavailable. Instead, the state purchased an area near Jamestown, but on the mainland, to host a temporary museum called Jamestown Festival Park. This time around, America was living through an era of prosperity and the Great American Road Trip, and the park's popularity soared. Jamestown Festival Park became permanent, growing into the living history experience we now call Jamestown Settlement, aka the one with the ships, which I'm constantly asked about when I'm working on the island. Last time I was here, you had ships. You're looking for our next door neighbors. But we're fortunate today in SWEM Special Collections to have access to materials written for the 1907 and the 1957 commemorations of Jamestown, side by side with other items such as John Smith's General History. So here you can trace for yourselves the evolution of Jamestown's place in American memory, from the earliest promotional propaganda of the Virginia Company of London, all the way through to the color brochures offering a sanitized white Anglo-Saxon Protestant perspective on the legacies of virtue, hard work, and piety that Jamestown supposedly embodied. And I'd like to devote the rest of this class period to that exploration. But first, I'm happy to take any questions you may have. This is a view of Jamestown in the 1930s, by the way. Yes? Oh, hang on.
When they originally built the State House and then it burned down 2 times, where in Williamsburg did they then rebuild?
Well, that is a bit of a fraught question because they don't have a purpose-built meeting place here initially either. They're actually using what we now call the Wren Building for the government until the first House of Burgesses, they can scrape together enough funding and contractors to get that erected. So the Wren Building has a long history as a multi-purpose space. And there are complaints that there's more attention being paid to the Burgesses than to the governor in those early days. Anyone else?
What is your costume?
Oh, I thought you should get the most authentic experience of my class as possible for today. And I am a historic costumer in my spare time. So I do first-person and third-person programming out at Jamestown Island when I'm not teaching here at the college. And for my first-person programs, I make my own attire. So the outfit that I have on today is what I wear when I'm portraying Lady Frances Berkeley, wife of the governor, Sir William Berkeley, who put down Bacon's Rebellion. And I thought I could class it up today for you, because the other two first-person characters I have are both middling to lower status. But I thought, by golly, I should put on a show. So that is the origin of my outfit. It's, you know, as accurate as I could manage for the 1670s. There aren't too many patterns floating around for that decade.
Have there been any, I guess, efforts to track down maybe the survivors or maybe artifacts of Confederate soldiers who were at the fort on top of Jamesport?
So out at Jamestown Island, we do have some people who are always on the lookout for auction sites and estate sales and other places where, you know, conceivably documents or artifacts relating to Jamestown might pop up. Usually, if they pop up, it's actually documents and it's back in England. But we've got some ears to the ground for sure. But I would encourage anyone who has a Southern background, check your attics, folks, please. We would love to have some of that stuff make its way back to us. But determining the provenance then would be very difficult unless you have accompanying letters saying, "Hey, Ma, look at this awesome pistol I just dug up at Jamestown." But you never know, it can happen.
While I know excavation digs are very frequent in Jamestown, are there any plans or have there ever been any James River excavations? Or
Yes.
do you guys just go like, if it's important, it'll wash up someday?
Oh boy. Yes, there were before James Fort was uncovered on land. I think the National Park Service was actually the one who sponsored some exploratory sinking of claws and whatnot into the river to see what they pulled up. And the result was honestly that they didn't find much. Now, part of that may be that the fort was actually on land the whole time. But there certainly has been a lot of erosion. I think it's a cost-benefit analysis at this point. You know, how much more could we glean about the past by going to the trouble and the expense of conducting underwater archaeology? And so far, you know, we've got 87% of the fort on land and more than 4 million artifacts over the last 30 years. So we're not hurting for material, and there's still plenty of places left on land that our archaeologists are continuing to explore. So I think, yeah, underwater archaeology may be in the future, but it's down the list of things we want to do. But a side note, corollary to that, more and more of our archaeology is underwater these days. Save Jamestown, everyone. It is sinking. Yes. Wait, 1 second.
How long do we have until it's fully eroded into the river?
Well, hopefully forever. There is a mitigation plan. We are fundraising for that right now. So there are designs, maps that have been circulated. I don't know that there's a public report yet, but we're working towards that, raising certain areas, and in the process of doing that, we're also going to make it more accessible, because right now it's all gravel paths, and it's very, very unwelcome if you have mobility issues. But there is certainly a process of triage going on right now with the archaeologists, getting as much data as they can out of where they can before they put in some additional dams, really, or breaks for the river or for the swamp, which is encroaching at an alarming rate, and then also making sure that all measures that have been supposed to be implemented in order to reduce the runoff that comes into the swamp, making sure that those are in fact followed through, because that has not always been the case, and that has made the problem worse. So cleaning drains, it's a very simple thing, but yet if it's not done, and especially this season of the year when it's just clogged with the falling leaves, everything that then can't go down the drain and all the runoff from the parking lots comes down onto our side of the island into the swamp. And it's just exacerbating what was already an issue because of rising tides. So we're hoping that within the next couple of years we'll begin implementing this plan, and then we'll see how far it can carry us. But the goal is that we're never going to lose Jamestown, and we'll never, I think, lose the fort proper, because they built it on the highest piece of land on the island. But all of that surrounding information is very much at risk, and they're not living inside the fort, not all of them all the time. It's a community of which the fort is the central defensive structure. So the domestic dwellings are outside the fort. Here, there's some in this backfield. There's a domestic dwelling over here as well that the archaeologists have just begun to uncover from the very earliest period. And the information in the trenches that they have dug in those areas has been very scarce, and some of that scarcity is probably due to the wet-dry cycle that the artifacts there have been subjected to over time, which just contributes to their deterioration. But yeah, there's so much more that we can figure out, and it's a race against time at this point.
I guess a similar question. We know that the riverbank used to be much further out. Would you say that it would have been a bit past those protruding seawalls there?
Oh yes, I should think so. Now, at the point of the island here, where the State House was, there's considerably more erosion there than there is the further you get down into the National Park Service side. So over in Newtown, they haven't actually lost that much shoreline, but up here, they definitely have 50 yards, maybe more, 75 yards off the point here, and then sort of gradually decreasing as you go back east along the shoreline.
Could you quickly go over the difference between the early preservation of Jamestown memory and what kind of preservation is happening now to preserve its memory?
We no longer seal things with cement. I'll start with that. That was one of the early efforts to preserve the church tower. They just plastered the hole inside, and it made the problem worse because it's trapping moisture, and then the bricks crumble more, and unless you match the ingredients of the mortar that was used at the time to the ingredients that you're trying to repair that mortar with. They do not live in harmony together. It's like organ rejection, I suppose. So a lot of the measures that, they were making a really good faith effort to preserve this stuff 100+ years ago, but we just have better technology now. So the church tower has been completely redone recently. They put a roof on it, just a glass roof, so you can still get the effect of looking up to the open sky there, but it is somewhat more protected from the elements. What else do we do differently? Quite a lot. There are decisions made now over, they fill holes in again. They don't leave things exposed, obviously, except for the kitchen cellar where they found the remains of the cannibalized female in 2012. But sometimes the best way to preserve artifacts is to cover them up again. So that's something that they're very conscious of. And leaving parts of trenches or areas for later excavation with the assumption that in 10 or 20 years, our ability to preserve what's there will have increased that much more. So I guess strategy has improved a lot. There's some irony, too, in that, previous digs that were done out here were extremely methodical. In the 30s and the 50s, a lot of digging on what's now the National Park Service side of the island, but also occasional forays onto our side of the island. And in 1949, actually, the archaeologists discovered the Palisade Wall, but they didn't know they discovered it. And maybe it's for the best, because had they uncovered the entire Palisade line in 1949, they would have had a different attitude towards preserving it than perhaps we have today, and different capabilities. So the artifacts go through really rigorous conservation in our lab building, always with the latest, best means of treating different types of objects. Metals or organics are treated very differently. So we've got a team of really expert people to figure out what the best course of action is. And sometimes you get an artifact like the silver reliquary box that's sealed shut. They couldn't open it. And had they dug that up in 1949, someone might have forced it open and destroyed the artifact in the process. But now we've got X-ray technology and all manner of medical tools, actually, that are able to assist us in the effort to see what's inside something without having to damage the exterior. So that's the course that the archaeologists took with that reliquary, and it allowed us to figure out not just what was inside, but also then to reproduce those things with a 3D printer so that the guests visiting the Archaearium could see versions of the objects inside the reliquary without having to damage the box itself. So a variety of answers, but I think a very good question.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Anybody else?
If there was a holy grail of something you'd love to find at Jamestown, what would it be?
Golly. I think every archaeologist and historian would have a different answer for that. And I'd have to give it a good long think. Part of the reason is that my particular interest, as fascinated as I am by every aspect of the history of Jamestown, I really like the later 17th century because it's underrepresented in my view. So the 1640s are a really crucial decade, and then the Bacon's Rebellion period. So I personally, with my bias, as you see, I would love to find anything over at the Green Springs site, which is, again, if you remember the slide from earlier, the home of Sir William Berkeley and Lady Frances Berkeley, his second wife. Anything that could be linked with Lady Berkeley would, for me, be the Holy Grail personally, because I have a deep and abiding interest in her life and her experience just being a woman at the pinnacle of Virginia society and influential in the political world as well as the social world. Anything that could help me flesh out who she was as a human being and what her relationship was with the people around her, specifically with Sir William, I would be in heaven if we found something like that. But that's part of the National Park Service side of Colonial National Historical Park. And there haven't been archaeological excavations out at Green Spring for a number of years at this point. And what we do have, although it was very exacting work at the time, it leaves much to be desired when we look back at it with a modern lens. They were unable to determine even the chronology of the building pattern out there, let alone link artifacts with specific individuals, although they did find a heck of a lot of pipe stems, which suggests certainly that this was a hub of political activity, especially during the years that Sir William Berkeley lived there, and all of the surrounding, bigwigs were coming to be wined and dined at Green Spring and talk politics all the while. So that's my answer to that.
Can you give us a little overview into the political space at the time when the State House was being moved to Middle Plantation?
The political space. Oh, you'd had a whole series of short-term governors after Berkeley, and you've got Francis Nicholson being a mover and a shaker. He also is not just responsible for designing and sort of overseeing the construction of Williamsburg, but also of Annapolis, Maryland. That's his other project. And they look very different geographically, but he is certainly a force to be reckoned with. James Blair, although he's not, ostensibly on the political side, he really is. He makes it his personal business several times to get governors of Virginia recalled. He does wield political power, even though he is a minister and the president of the College of William and Mary. So he is a major force to be reckoned with, and certainly one of the most vocal proponents of moving the capital to Williamsburg, and I wouldn't say the deciding factor. I don't want to give ourselves too much credit, but he does encourage and perhaps even write speeches to be delivered by William and Mary students to convince the Burgesses and the powers that be that this move is a good idea. And they're delivered from the front of the Wren building, as now it is called. And I don't know that I consider them terribly persuasive on the face of it, but they do make a series of semi-logical arguments for moving the capital that would appeal to the government. And one of them is that this is an up-and-coming place where the community will support the government and the government will support the community, and it'll be a nice symbiotic relationship because you've got a seat of education here, you've got a seat of religion here in Bruton Parish, you have all the ingredients necessary to form a thriving community. And that, along with the fact that Williamsburg is not a port, which the suggestion is made in these speeches that means it's better defensible. Jamestown, being a port city, was also vulnerable to attack from sea then, or from river rather. And twice during the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 17th century, the Dutch fleet does sail up the James River and burns the Virginia tobacco fleet. So, when I initially read those speeches, I thought, wow, that's a bit far-fetched. You're pitching Williamsburg because there is no river access, and that seems strange. But in light of more recent events that might have been in the minds of guys like the Burgesses, that's maybe not a bad thing. And, of course, they had been not necessarily the guys in 1699, but within living memory, Bacon's Rebellion, essentially held hostage in their own state house by Bacon and an armed mob of 500 people. So, defensibility might have been on their minds in that regard as well. Jamestown Island, there are some certainly military advantages of its position, but also some military disadvantages. If you cut off that isthmus, like Bacon did, the only way out is by boat, but if you're moving a large force, that's not necessarily an advantage.
Could you discuss briefly the difficulty that memorialization and the preservation of memory have coexisting within Jamestown?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I warn you, as you've all by now learned, I do nothing briefly. So, for many years at Jamestown, the prevailing narrative certainly focused on the big names that show up in the history books like John Smith and Christopher Newport. John Smith was, I mean, there's a statue of him that was erected in 1909 and a statue of Pocahontas, and there's no statues of anybody else out there. And that is indicative of the style of commemorization and memory that was current really all the way up until, I could argue anyway, the 1990s, when there was something physical there that pertained to the 17th century that people could look at and learn from. Prior to that, for much of the 20th century, it had been largely a driving park. So you came off the ferry from the Scotland side. It actually came off on a wharf that faced that tricentennial monument, the huge obelisk. And then the road curved, well, the main road went straight, but you could curve off to the left and go through the gates to Jamestown, and you paid your nickel or whatever it was. And it was a driving tour of a couple of statues and a sign that said, "Congratulations, the fort is in the river." And so you were there mostly to reflect and imagine, I think, what you wanted Jamestown to be, because its very absence encouraged you to give way to your own flights of fancy about it. And that was much the intent of the original APVA. It was a pilgrimage site as far as they were concerned. This is a civic religion that they're trying to inculcate within the population of Virginia. Honor Jamestown because these are your roots and this is your heritage. And they did conduct annual pilgrimages to the church out at Jamestown in the early years of the APVA. Now, and for a while, once the archaeology took off, and I love the depth and breadth of the archaeology that we have out there. It's such a rich little time capsule, and I'm all for the archaeology. But that we became so focused on the archaeology for a while that became the prevailing narrative, to the exclusion of some of the broader context of those artifacts that were coming out of the ground. And you can't really properly interpret those objects without understanding what they meant to the people who used them on a day-to-day basis. And that requires, I think, informing the public of the broader history. So we now have archaeology tours almost every morning, history tours in the afternoon. So there's a team really just of three of us who do sort of the history tour side of things. But we're very intent now on bringing attention as much as possible to as many themes about Jamestown as possible. So my colleague Mark Summers leads wonderful tours, Powhatan in English, talking about the early interactions and the roller coaster ride of the diplomacy and warfare between the English and the Powhatan. He leads the Powhatan 1622 tour. He leads the First Africans tour, which establishes not just what we can glean of the experience of the 20 and odd Africans who are brought to Virginia in 1619, but also what the backdrop was that would have informed the English understanding about race and slavery. So what baggage were they bringing with them from Europe that may have contributed or not, to the situation that these Africans in the early days found themselves in. So that's a wonderfully informative tour. My colleague Willie Balderson does a lot of first-person living history as one of John Smith's entourage. So just an ordinary soldier who was a nobody back in England, and what his experience was being the figures in the background when you've got these wonderful 19th century paintings and the central, focal point is John Smith or Pocahontas or whomever. But filling in the edges is what we're now really committed to doing. So I just brought on board an indentured servant interpretation from the 1640s, so I get to talk then also about the relationship between Virginia and Maryland, which I think we need to talk about more. It's very adversarial. They have a very porous border for many years, and that leads to a lot of conflict, but there's also the ideological battle of the supposedly dyed-in-the-wool Protestant Anglican colony in Virginia being asked to assist and enable the creation of a Catholic haven colony just to the north that cuts off some of the land that had previously been under the Virginia Charter. So there's a lot of ill will there, but also a lot of cross-pollination, if I may use that phrase. Virginians who also own property in Maryland, Marylanders who also own property in Virginia, and sometimes serve in both governments over the course of their lifetimes. So I think that's definitely worth exploring in more depth. And it also brings a different lens of religious pluralism, not exactly diversity perhaps, but Mark, the colleague that I talked about a moment ago, has also just introduced a tour he calls Holy Ground, which is about the different flavors of religion that were present at Jamestown in the early days, to the best of our ability to analyze that.
How were people getting on and off the island? Because like at Green Springs, that's off the island. Mm-hmm. And I know today we have like footbridges that we can walk on, and there's like bridges that we can travel from like where the glass house is to the island. Was there bridges at the time? Was it down the river?
The isthmus did exist. It's been periodically a true island, however, at multiple times throughout its history, because we're prone to hurricanes in Virginia, and we've had some really bad ones over the years. So hopefully it's not going to happen again, but the last time Jamestown Island was an island was 2003, after Isabel. And the isthmus, the bridge there washed out. And yeah, it was cut off. So in 1907, for that commemoration, it was also a period of time when the island was an island for real, and they were ferrying people from the mainland over to the island. So certainly boat travel in the 17th century and the 18th century is easier than foot travel. The roads aren't very good, and they would be crossing that back river with regularity in order to get to the mainland, but they could also go via the isthmus. So the main road off the island, called the Old Great Road, is the road that we basically go in on now. It's in that spot. And there are reports from very, very early 1607 even, that summer, that this was an old native trail, and that the Englishmen were exploring down it some 5 miles or so. So there you go.
If there was a fiction that many of the general public has about Jamestown, what would be the first one, the one you'd most like to erase?
The presence of gentlemen, I think. There is still somewhat of a negative flavor, bad taste in people's mouths, I guess, about the number of gentlemen who were recruited for the first voyage in 1606, who arrived in 1607. The Virginia Company has taken a lot of abuse for that decision, but I think it's important to remember that the ordinary Englishman during this period didn't know how to fire a gun, didn't know how to hunt and fish. It's the gentlemen who do all of that stuff. The gentlemen who are the soldiers, who have had the experience of trying to oust the Spanish Habsburgs from the Netherlands in those wars, who have participated in the subjugation of Ireland prior to coming to Virginia. And because the Virginia Company knows that they are risking causing an international incident, settling in territory that Spain had already claimed and had had boots on the ground in the 1570s before they were expelled or killed by the Powhatan. They're expecting the Spanish army to descend any day. So, yes, they didn't bring average Joe laborers in the kinds of numbers that it might have behooved them to do. And the gentlemen are very averse to that manual labor that's really necessary for survival in Virginia. But the flip side of that is the gentlemen are crucial for the defense of the colony. Everyone can be taught how to use a gun, but the gentlemen, in theory, already have that background and can supervise the instruction of others and be the cool head. Because if you've got a bunch of, frankly, frat boys in a swamp who've never handled a gun before, and you ask them to defend this place, what's going to happen? You need guys who have years of experience to keep things in order, to tell them, okay, hold your fire, now you fire, and just to generally prevent things from going horribly awry. And many of the times when things do go horribly awry in the early encounters, I think it is a function of the wrong guy was in charge. Really, Smith's the guy you want. But the theory was a good one in sending the gentlemen. The fact that some of the gentlemen were absolutely rubbish soldiers was not what the Virginia Company had anticipated as the outcome. Great. I have exhausted your every query. I'm so satisfied. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. This has really been a pleasure, and I appreciate all of the interaction and the questions you've thrown at me, and I know I haven't always had precisely the answer you were looking for, but I hope that I was able to talk around the swamp a bit and expand upon what you already knew. So, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit our website at cspan.org.